again, interwebs land. I'm really going to have to come up with a better intro than this. Anyway, okay. So welcome back. If this is the first time you're tuning in, I would absolutely recommend that you go back and look at the last couple that we've kind of talked about. Last week's was very much about kind of understanding a little bit about anxiety, a little bit about ACT, which is kind of the model that we're using, both of which I think are, well, they're kind of fundamental to everything else that we're doing. First week was just a little bit more about me, I suppose. This week we're kind of taking the next step in considering at least partially anxiety, but also how ACT fits into it as well. So this week's is very much based on the head. This is the thinking part of anxiety. Next week we're dealing a lot more with kind of the emotional side, so we're starting to kind of break it down a bit. This week's is very much about the stuff that happens in your head. So there is basically, we're going to start, I suppose, with talking about the idea of thinking traps. So what happens in your head? It has its own very peculiar way of dealing with things. There's kind of this belief, I suppose, that people will talk about the idea that thinking is negative, that your head is automatically goes towards that idea of, oh, I've got to think of the worst case scenario, I've got to think about that. Now, part of that is that's anxiety, right? That's what anxiety does. But there is absolutely a functional side to that. There is actually, like, it has a purpose. It's doing what it thinks it needs to do. So when we talk about the idea of negative thinking in this regard, right? Because there is an aspect which we'll probably come to at some point which talks a little bit about negative thinking. But what we're talking about in this part is not, I wouldn't consider it negative. You see, the brain, in its purest form, is hardwired for survival. It is designed to keep you alive. That's its basic function. Now, when I talk about people, no, I don't talk about people. When I talk to people about the brain, I will always identify 3 rules. There are 3 rules that your brain will run on when we go back far enough. So you'll remember when I talked about anxiety last week, and if you haven't, then go back and this will all make sense. Anxiety is based on this kind of almost cave person brain. It's designed on the threat, the fight, the flight, the anger floof, that's a callback to last time as well, the saber-toothed tiger in the door. That's where the basis of the anxiety comes from. When we go back to those days, we had 3 rules. The human brain had 3 rules. Don't get eaten, find food, find shelter. Now, if I'm in my cave at the end of the day, I'm obviously I haven't been eaten because I'm sitting in my cave, and I found shelter because it's a lovely cave, but I may not have found food. Now, my brain is not interested in the nice cave that's all very, cavey. It's interested in what's the threat, what's the thing that could actually kill me tomorrow. And not eating, that leads to a lot of problems. If you're not going to starve to death overnight, but the less you eat, the more weak you are, the less you're able to go hunting, the more likely you are to then get eaten or not find shelter. So there's this whole kind of component right from back there where the human brain was designed to look for the threat, look for the deficit, look for the thing that's going to kill us. Now, the problem we have there is, fast forward to nowadays, we don't have the anger floof, we don't have the saber-toothed tiger, but our brain is still trying to do the same thing. So no matter what's going on for it, it's looking for the threat, it's looking for the deficit, it's looking for the danger, because that's what's going to keep it alive. It's almost a no harm, no foul kind of position, right? If my brain is looking for the threat and it's preparing for the threat and the threat doesn't happen As far as survival goes, no harm, no foul. That is absolutely fine. If I'm prepared for the threat and it doesn't happen, not a problem. The issue is, survival-wise, no harm, no foul. Head-wise, a lot of harm. The more I'm focused on the threat, the more likely I am to get caught up in that and miss the stuff that's not threat. So, as kind of part of this idea, that's where the human brain kind of gets trapped, because it is also, over this period in time, it's then developed to be a problem solver. So we've established the sense that it finds the threat, it finds the deficit, it finds the danger. It automatically goes looking now for how to problem solve, how to fix that, how to make that less of a problem. One of the things, and this is when we start talking a little bit near the end, I'll come back to the idea of fusion, and we'll talk about fusion a bit more then. But the issue with the problem solving process, this problem solving mode, this part of your brain that goes, right, step 1, step 2, step 3, how do we solve this deficit, this danger, this thing that's not available? It assumes there's some control. It assumes that you have control over the environment, that you can have control over your thoughts, it has control over your feelings. It doesn't really understand the nuances and the complications of stuff that's going on. So like I said, we'll come back a little bit more to that when we start talking about kind of fusion. However, it's holding that idea, that's kind of the idea of what we're going through here, right? There's these kind of bits and pieces going on in your head. Part of it wants to assume you've got control. A lot of it is about survival, making sure you're alive, finding the threat, finding the deficit, because then we can manage it. It's doing all that kind of stuff unconsciously. It's doing all that stuff underneath the surface. To take not necessarily a side pitch here, but another component that falls into this idea of the problem-solving process and the automatic functioning here is a thing called bias. Now, when people say bias, they normally think of kind of stereotypes. Bias is not quite stereotypes. Bias is very much a thinking trap, right? I think from memory, I think last week I mentioned something about a logic trap, this idea of our head convinces us of something because it all logically makes sense. When we consider bias, it's the same kind of thing. So I want you to take a moment and put together a really quick, think of it like an elevator pitch of your life. Just without putting too much thought into it, just really quickly, think about like the highlights reel. My guess would be, if anxiety is a real prominent kind of thing, if it's a major issue, my guess will be the first few of those, possibly more than the first few, will be the negative things. They will be the snapshots of regret. They'll be that time in high school when you had to stand in front of everybody and make a speech. They'll talk about, or it will highlight embarrassment. It'll highlight that time when things didn't go how you wanted them to. Now, like I said, there are some people that there's going to be those intermixed with kind of ones around pride or happiness or excitement. But when anxiety is something that is very strong, that is very prominent in our kind of everyday functioning, it's going to highlight all those negative ones way more, and they're going to come up first. Generally, I hold this kind of position where I talk about time and space. So I'm a very big believer in the fact that with any of the kind of logic traps, any of the thought processes, any of these kind of things that are going on in your head, and emotions as well, my stance a lot of the time is give it time, give it space. We have to just kind of manage how I'm dealing with this as it's happening, because given enough time, I said, even when anxiety is quite strong and those first kind of, the first parts of that reel are going to be the negatives, they're going to be the sadness, the embarrassment, the fear, the regret, the shame. If you let that go through, if you just let that kind of cycle, you don't buy into it, you don't jump on it, ride it down the street like a pony, if you just let it exist for a bit, some of those positives will start to come through. So I am very big on time and space. And that's possibly a little bit of almost a strategy, I suppose, will be let it sit, let it have time. And we'll probably again come back to that a little bit, because that is a very act kind of process. I think we spoke a little bit about the idea of clouds, the emotional clouds coming through. We kind of just got to let them happen and then let them go on their own accord. Thinking is the same. You let all that through, as long as you don't fuse with it. Again, we're going to come back to fusion. You can then allow that to exist, and some of those positives will come through. Is I suppose almost a definition of bias. And I think I actually wrote this one down and put it in my little notes in front of me, because I knew I'd forget to define it if I didn't. Bias is a weighted belief or perception. So that's kind of the definition of a bias. It's a belief, it's a perception, but for whatever reason it has this additional weight on it. And normally the additional weight is unfortunately because of experience. Like, things will have happened that have created that belief or that perception. That doesn't mean it's accurate. This is when we talk about logic traps, thinking traps. I mean, traps is kind of the key word, right? It doesn't mean that it's accurate. It doesn't mean that it's correct. But it absolutely has weight. It feels like it's accurate. And so there are two types of bias that I always talk to people about: expectation bias and confirmation bias. In a nutshell, the easiest example that I can use for these two is, let's say I leave the office at the end of the day and I need to be home because something's happening, right? My daughter's got a dance thing, or some reason that I've got to be home. And I leave 5 minutes late. The very first thing that's going to kick in is going to be my expectation bias. Now, we've already clarified, right? What my head does, the survival side of my head, is it automatically assumes the worst. It looks for the threat, the deficit, the thing that's going to cause the problem. So when I have the expectation bias as I leave the house, and chances are, I'm talking about traffic, I'm talking about getting home, you're all doing the same thing, right? Every single red light, going to get stuck in traffic. I'm going to get stuck behind two trucks racing. That's always a fun one, isn't it? When you're going up a hill and there's trucks, and one of those trucks has decided it's going to overtake, but it's traveling at like 2 k's more than the truck it's overtaking. So this is what my expectation bias does. Now, it doesn't just make that up. This is the point. This is the thing about bias. It doesn't just make that up out of nowhere. It makes that up, or it thinks about that, because I've done that. I've been going somewhere and it feels like every single red light, and it takes me 15 minutes longer to get home than it normally would. However, this is where the confirmation bias kicks in. So the expectation bias is, I'm going to assume the worst, I'm going to expect this to happen. The confirmation bias, that's the bit we've got to be real careful of. Because confirmation bias does two things. The first one is, I hate when a definition includes the word, but I'm just going to have to go with that, right? The first one is, it confirms my expectation. So it sees what I expect to see. So on my way home, I go through, say, 6 sets of lights. It's going to see every single red light that I have to stop at. And it's going to say, told you so. It's the whole, there's kind of a catch cry for both biases, and I'll talk about them in a second. But it's going to say, yep, there it is, knew that was going to happen. So that's stage one. It picks up the things in real time of what I'm expecting to see. However, step two is almost more dangerous, because step two is, it automatically, unconsciously represses and ignores the things that are contrary to my expectation. So following this lights example, I go through 6 sets of lights. 4 of those are red. 2 of them are green. When I get home and somebody says to me, whether it's my wife, my daughter, somebody says, how was your trip? Terrible. Every single red light, stuck in traffic, it all just comes through. The confirmation bias remembers the 4 red lights and highlights those, tells me all about them in my head. It ignores the green lights. And sometimes that's as simple as, that was a fluke. It convinces me that those are less important, that they're somehow abnormal, they're the things that don't fit. Or it literally just doesn't even notice the green lights. It focuses so much on the red lights and so much on that car's going to cut me off and that's going to slow me down again, and it focuses so much on all that, it literally misses the green lights. So the expectation bias and the confirmation bias, these are the two kind of, the 1-2 punch of biases and perception and belief. So I said there was kind of a catch cry for both of them. And the way that I suppose I would describe it is the expectation bias, the catch cry is, you wait. And the confirmation bias catch cry is, I told you so. Now you go back and you think about any situation that you've been in where you know that there was some anxiety there, where you know that you were kind of stressed and there was stuff happening. And I guarantee you, in there somewhere, your head will have been saying, you wait, this is going to happen. See, I told you so. Oh, you wait, that person's going to do this. See, there it is, told you so. The more these 2 biases interplay, and the more we unconsciously or without thinking, we just kind of agree with them or let them just roll in. We don't think about it, we just take that as the absolute truth, the stronger they get. And this is where bias fits in. This is how bias plays into our heads. Like I said, it doesn't come out of nowhere. Biases are not, I make this up because why would I want to be, feeling good about stuff? No. Biases have some level of reality. But when they really start to come in, it's that waiting. It's whatever's going on for us, we lose sight of some things and we focus on others, and that's where a bias becomes an issue. How I try and, I suppose, deal with, how I try and manage, how I suggest that we try and get around this kind of bias process. Last week, hopefully, I'm testing my memory here, right? Last week, hopefully, I talked a little bit about mindfulness being noticing. That's my definition of mindfulness. When people talk about mindfulness, I will literally bring that down to the stage of what you are doing is consciously noticing. That is mindfulness. And there's an element of that, which ties into how we manage bias and how we deal with kind of these thinking traps and this whole kind of process that our head goes through of finding the deficit, finding the threat. Because there are what we would almost refer to as 2 selves that are attached here. There is the thinking self and there is the observing self. Now, the thinking self, that is usually described as a stream of consciousness, right? When you talk about the thinking self, that's that constant little voice that just goes in your head. The thing about the thinking self is, it's the one that's got all of the judgments. It's got all of the expectations, talk a little bit about that bias. It makes the decisions, the evaluations, it decides all of the things based on the spiel. There's actually a theory or a principle that comes out. It's a form of, I think it actually comes out of feminist psychology. Yeah, psychology has all these little kind of silos that we would talk about. And feminist psychology is one of the ones that I kind of got this principle, or I learned this principle from. And it's the idea of what we talk about first voice, second voice. And the idea of first voice and second voice is, whenever something happens, whenever I see something, my very initial assessment, evaluation, or judgment of that That is what I would refer to as my first voice. The difficulty is the first voice is often not my voice. It's the voice of my parents. It's the voice of the people around me, my friends or my family. It's the voice of, in some instances it can be the media or society. The first voice is not an internal voice. It's usually a voice that has been given to you by people or situations around you that you've kind of started to own yourself. And so the classic example of this, how do I put that one? So you go to a shopping centre. Actually, this is a good one because I remember the ad that this talked about. So you go to a shopping centre and there's a dude walking through the shopping centre wearing budgie smugglers. Now, for those of you who remember the ad, undies, bathers. Sorry, callback. Half the people watching this are going, what are you? Anyway. Dude walking through the shopping centre wearing budgies. Budgie smugglers, not wearing budgies. That would actually be kind of cool. Like Birdman with budgies. Anyway, budgie smugglers walking through. First voice. Oh my God, what is he doing? What is he wearing? He can't be wearing that. This is ridiculous. The first voice, however, maybe budgie smugglers is not a great. Let's just go with board shorts, because budgie smugglers, there's some queries there. Let's go with board shorts, right? But nothing but board shorts. That first voice is still going to kick in. What is he doing? This is not the beach. He's in right? So the first voice, that's going to be just rolling. What we want is the opportunity to give the second voice time. Talked a little bit, right? Time and space. It's my principle on everything. The second voice is more often than not the internal voice. It is also the observing self. So I'll link all this back together. You may think I'm just rabbiting on, but there's a whole logic to this, right? So the second voice, that is more the internal voice. Now I go to the shopping centre and this dude's walking through wearing not budgie smugglers, wearing board shorts, and I'm like, oh, this is. If I give that enough time, the second voice kicks in and goes, yeah, but he's not hurting anybody. It's not actually impacting anybody. It's nothing. It's not a big deal. Now, the more you practice that, I've now got to the stage that that first voice can kick in, and my second voice will often kick in within seconds. But I've still got the first voice. Now, to tie this back into the thinking self, observing self, the thinking self is the voice that just runs, that's making the assessments, it's making the judgments. It's giving you that's not right, that shouldn't be happening, that's that thinking self, that first voice. The observing self. The observing self is much more about experiences and just noticing things. The observing self, also possibly considered the second voice, that's automatically in line with mindfulness that we talked about, that idea of just noticing. So what kind of generally happens in any event that occurs? We get caught because with our biases, with this expectation bias, with this confirmation bias, with this thoughts about the negative, the threat, the deficit, the thing that's the danger, all of this stuff comes together in the thinking self. And the thinking self just runs. It's the hamster on the wheel. It just runs. It goes with everything and it gives you all the information that it thinks you desperately, desperately need. What we want to be able to practice, what we want to be able to give time and space to, is the observing self. The ability to go, whoa, hang on a second. Let's just take a breath and let's look at this. I don't have to problem solve it yet. The observing self is not about problem solving. The observing self is about stopping for a second and going, whoa. Let's just look at all the information. Let's actually get all the information before we've got to think about what we're doing here. Time and space. The observing self, the other way potentially to consider it, and this is going slightly more geeky, so bear with me. first-person shooter or a first-person game, thinking self. This is my vision. This is what I've got. That's everything. The observing self is a third-person game. I'm outside of it. I can see me in the context of everything that's here. Now, some people love first-person games. I hate them. Mainly because I'm terrible at computer games. But if I'm in a first person, something's happening over here and I'm getting shot at or whatever the game I'm playing is, I've got no idea what's going on. It's just like, it's weird when you think that I live my life as a first person, but still, it's just, I can't get around that. Now, whether that's some, awesomely magical thing that I've spent so much time practicing my noticing self that it's, look, I could get all psychological and I'm sure I could come up with a really awesome story about how that makes me a great person or something, but I'm not, so it's fine. But that is the way to kind of consider this. When you are caught in the thinking self mode, your anxiety is running the show. There's no time, there's no space, there's no context. It is focused. It is focused on the threat. It is focused on, let me make that judgment, let me make that evaluation of what's happening and who that person is and what they're doing and why that's happening, because that's the stuff that's going to keep me safe. Sometimes that's possibly accurate, but a vast majority of the time, it is not. It is unhelpful. You're getting caught in something. We don't want to be caught. And so a lot of the times, awareness is kind of the first step, right? When I talk to anybody about anything, if we don't have awareness, we can't change. You don't know what you don't know until you know it. And then you still don't know it, but now you know you don't know it. I'll come back to that later. But you don't know what you don't know. So if I'm caught in the middle of it, I've got to kind of teach myself just to stop for a second and take a figurative step back. Because a figurative step back is coming into the observing self. That's the position that I then get to go, okay, what's actually going on here? Now, that figurative step back, the observing self, I will talk again about that next week because that is a very specific aspect of when we are emotionally dealing with anxiety through ACT as well. But rather than stealing my own thunder from next week, when we talk about emotions, that noticing self, it's going to come back. That figurative step back, that is absolutely going to be a core kind of component of dealing with emotions. I've mentioned a couple of times, fusion. So, fusion, how do I define this? Fusion is basically having a belief in an absolute truth. Now, it's a catch cry that I use, I know. I apologize in advance, but I have so many catch cries and so many things, rules that I live my life, all that kind of stuff. They kind of just sneak out. But I have a catch cry, another one, which is certainty makes me uncomfortable. And I don't mean certainty in a situation. I mean, when you meet people who are absolutely certain, I actually find that to be a really uncomfortable situation. Because I live in shades of grey. I don't believe in absolutes. I don't actually believe there's a black and white. It's all shades of grey. Fusion is a phenomena that ACT talks about, which is having an absolute truth. The thing about absolute truths are they are very frequently actually true. And so this is the kind of component of where fusion kicks in. So you'll remember an example of this is, I think last week I mentioned the idea of personalizing. So I am a happy person, and in ACT what we want to be able to say is I am a person currently experiencing happiness. I want to create just a step from that. And the idea of fusion kicks into this, right? Because if I fuse with the idea that I am a happy person, I don't know about you, but I've not been happy 100% of my time. I don't know anybody who is happy 100% of the time. Now, if I've fused with this rule for life, this absolute truth that I'm a happy person, when I don't feel happy, that completely warps my head. That makes me question who I am. It makes me question what I stand for. It makes me question people. It just starts this process because I have fused with the idea of being something. So I'm going to get you to do a little exercise for me. So the next little bit, I'll encourage you to do it. I'm going to do it slowly. I may know I'm not prepared enough to write stuff down, but I will grab a clipboard in a second to kind of show you what I mean. What I'd like you to do is take a piece of paper. Hopefully you're somewhere where you've got a piece of paper. If you're not, think about what you might do. Even think of your hand as a piece of paper. Like, right, I can work with whatever. Ooh, good idea. I'm going to use my hand as the piece of paper. It'll save me having to go and get a clipboard. What I'd like you to do is on that piece of paper, if you have one, and you have a pen, to write down, I need to not be anxious. Because my sense is, a lot of people, when we are experiencing anxiety or we have anxiety in our lives, that's starting to get to this idea of an absolute truth, an absolute rule, is I'm gonna get this idea. And what I want to highlight by getting you to write down, I need to not be anxious, is it doesn't have to be a negative belief. Fusing with any kind of belief is not particularly helpful. So if you don't have the pen and paper, imagine on your hand there is a thing that says, I need to not be anxious. That's our thing. I need to not be anxious. Now I want you to take that piece of paper. I want you to take that hand. And I want you to hold it right in front of your face. And now I'd like you, so just think, and you know what, answer me out loud if you can, because that tickles my fancy and makes me feel like it's way cooler. How much are you interacting with me? How much are you interacting with the world? How much around you can you see? Because the short answer is going to be, you can take the piece of paper down now. The short answer is, it's not going to be a lot. When I hold whatever this absolute truth is, whatever this belief is, like I said, it doesn't matter if it's a positive belief or a helpful or an unhelpful belief. It doesn't matter what the belief is. If I hold something so strongly that it's here, I'm not interacting with the world. I'm not interacting with my own life. All I'm interacting with is that belief, and it blocks me from seeing things. Diffusion. It's obviously the opposite of fusion. The catch cry, the way to think of it, I think, or how I would talk about the way to think about diffusion, is to identify it as two words. It is. Not it is true, not it is accurate, not it is anything, just it is. ACT is very much the acceptance, right? Acceptance, commitment, therapy. Acceptance. Acceptance is being able to acknowledge or being able to identify that something is happening. You'll hear all these kind of things tie in, right? The noticing self, or the observing self, the noticing, the mindfulness, all of this is about it is. No judgments, no evaluations, just an acknowledgement that something is happening. Now take that piece of paper. So rather than holding it up in your face now, or your hand, as we discussed, I want you to hold it just lightly in front of you. Does that pick up on the camera? I'm kind of holding it here. There you go. Just hold it lightly in front of you. Down here. Ideally on your lap, but you can't see my hand down here. So just hold it lightly. Now how much of the world can you interact with? Now how much of your life do you have around you? It's not about not having beliefs. It's not about not holding them, not feeling that they need to be there. It's about realizing that they are not absolute. No black, no white. Everything's shades of grey. When we start talking about beliefs, the idea we want to get to, are these helpful? Not good or bad, certainly not right or wrong. Right and wrong I have all kinds of issues with. Right and wrong in terms of correct and incorrect, yeah, cool, some things require that. But right and wrong in terms of a moral judgment, don't get me started on that one. Consider instead, is this belief helpful? Now, if this belief is helpful, hold it lightly in front of you. Here, because I've got a camera, but in your lap. Hold that belief. I'm not here to tell you that any of your beliefs are not okay, as long as they're helpful. As long as they don't impact other people, and as long as they don't impact your interaction with the world. Anxiety will convince you that that belief is so strong that it needs to be here. It will convince you that it's the difference between life and death. It will convince you that if you don't follow that belief, if you don't hold that absolute belief and absolute truth right in front of you and really focus on it, that is the end of civilization. Anxiety is really good at going to the extreme ridiculousness. It's fantastic at it. If it didn't feel so true, it'd be hilarious and make a great movie. The idea of diffusion is understanding that we have these beliefs, that I have this bias, that I have this first voice, that I have this thinking self. It's knowing that all that is there. Diffusion is knowing it's there, just being able to kind of hold it lightly in front of us, realize it's there, hold on to it, but don't live through it. I'm going to kind of wrap up on that, right? I'm always conscious when I do this, when there's not somebody feeding back, I just like throw information at people. So while I can't see the camera enough to know if people are asking questions, by all means, between kind of these live streams, send me questions, ask me questions. Somebody here will know enough about technology to get those questions to me and I can talk about them. So I do feel like I'm just throwing information. Consider this as kind of this basis of the wrap-up, right? So we've talked about the idea of this kind of negativity in our thinking and how it's actually functional. Like originally it had a purpose. It's just not so helpful nowadays. We've talked a little bit about the idea of the bias, this kind of weighted belief, this weighted perception about the absolute truths and the idea of the just you wait and the I told you so's. And we've talked a little bit about this sense of kind of the first person versus the third person and the ability to kind of not get caught up in that first voice and that stream of consciousness and holding just that belief so that it's not absolute, but it's still there. It's fine. There's no issues with it being there as long as it's helpful. The aim of anything around ACT is not to get rid of the thoughts. It's not to like the thoughts. It's not about wanting the thoughts. Anything that happens in our heads, it's not about doing something with it. It's about acknowledging that it's there. It's about accepting that it is there, but it is also about holding it lightly. It's you holding it lightly, not it controlling you. I go all the way back because we talked a little bit about the sense and problem solving stuff about feeling like we've got to control things to be able to solve problems. I want you to think about the diffusion, I want you to think about ACT, and in terms of how it applies to the anxiety is I don't have to make the anxiety go away. I don't have to stop the thoughts. I don't have to argue with the thoughts. I need to be able to acknowledge the thoughts, and I want to be able to hold those thoughts, but just as part of everything else that's going on. I want to be able to experience my life. The thoughts are going to be there. Can't do anything about that. I don't have control over my thoughts. They're just kind of there. But what I can control, we talked a little bit last time around, what I can control is my behavior. I can have that thought, that can be sitting there. I'm going to choose to acknowledge it and to interact with the world while I hold that thought or that anxiety kind of just loosely and lightly in front of me. And now I'm aware I've probably said that like 7 times, so it's probably time for me to wrap up. So as always, if you have any questions, if you have any feedback, by all means fire them through to us, whether that's on the Facebooky thing itself, whether that's via Messenger. Feel free to interact. Like, I was going to say, talk to me. Send communication. I don't know, we'll work this out. We'll work out a cool way of describing it eventually. If you, as I said at the beginning, if you haven't already kind of looked at the previous videos, absolutely go back and just kind of have a look at those. And bearing in mind that this is very much, this is the primer. This is an introduction to the program that we run, which is very similar in terms of the concepts, but it's a lot more in depth. It's a lot more time for processing. It's a lot more time, not one-on-one, but with me in front of you to actually kind of do things like this, to talk through, to ask those questions. So we'll always kind of post up when things are coming up. If you see the Acting on Anxiety program coming up and you're enjoying just these little snippets of stuff, absolutely kind of put your name down, sign up, find out the information. Other than that, I'm going to leave it at that. And I look forward to, well, that sounds really bad. I look forward to you seeing me next week. I'm sure there's a much like less, my head is this big way of describing that, but I don't know what it is. So I look forward to staring into a little camera and having people on the other end interact with what I'm talking about next week. Yeah, this is just like a train going out. Okay, see you next week.